Mark Lewisohn, welcome to the Beatles Every Little Thing.
Thank you, Ken.
We're going to start with a very obvious question to ask you since you are writing the Beatles biography, and by all means it's supposed to be the most comprehensive biography on the Beatles. Why the need for another Beatles biography?
Well, I don't know how many Beatle books you have in your library, quite a lot, I would imagine. I certainly have several hundred. I don't know exactly how many, maybe 500. There aren't actually, though, that many biographies. It's still a field that is dominated by Hunter Davies and Philip Norman. And many people seem to think that Philip Norman's book is the best. Shout! It came out in 1981. That's already in itself over 30 years ago. And the Hunter Davies book, of course, came out in the 60s, 1968. So that's really been around nearly 50 years now.
Right.
We now know a lot more than we knew in those days. There's more knowledge, more information. But more to the point, I just felt that I didn't really want to go to my grave knowing that those books were being held up as the standard word on the Beatles when I knew they could be done so much better. And I'm not trying to be disrespectful to Hunter Davies or Philip Norman, but I just felt that those could not be the best biographies of the Beatles. There have been one or two others, but they're not generally considered to be as good as Davies and Norman. So I also felt that you can't really do this story in one book. Not if you're trying to tell the complete biography, the complete history, because one book, by its very definition, is limited to, at the very most, probably 1,000 pages. Most biographies are a lot smaller than that. And I just thought that if you try and cram the Beatles story into a book of that size, you have to leave far too much out that is actually necessary, that it's important, that it's there. And so I just thought this story needs to be done properly. Every day one sees in the media ridiculously bad, wrong, stupid things being written about the Beatles, and I just felt that this story is getting more wrong with every passing year, and someone needs to put the flag down and say, actually, to the best of our knowledge, this is what happened. And so I decided I would do it.
Well, I applaud you so much for that because I've seen so much inaccuracies in Beatle books. What about the Beatles Anthology? What about for people who think, well, it's the Beatles in their own words, you can't get any better than that?
Well, you can't, in the sense of that being the first-person book. I mean, the Anthology is a major contribution to Beatles knowledge, and I'm really glad that they did it, and I'm very glad that we have it. But it isn't the complete story, because it's only the story, by definition, it is their story as they remembered it. And they remembered it fairly well, in fact, very well, but not perfectly well. And of course, there's plenty of topics that it doesn't cover at all. And what it certainly doesn't cover is the Beatles from an objective point of view. It's very much a subjective book. So it's a great contribution to our knowledge, but again, it isn't the be-all and end-all book. And I wanted to write, I feel that the world needs, and I need to write, the be-all and end-all book. A book that will stand the test of time, a book that is demonstrably accurate, a book that has everything properly attributed, a book that really revels in its sources, a book that tells you a lot of things you don't know and absolutely establishes the truth of what, the kind of things that we do know but haven't necessarily read in the right order or in the right context or properly revealed and explained. It's a truly tremendously exciting story, and the more it gets told decade after decade, it's now 50 years, the more it gets kind of squashed flat. And I want to pump oxygen back into this story. I want it to be up and breathing and being really exciting again, because it was phenomenally exciting.
Just as someone who's been doing a lot of Beatle programs now for 30 years, one of the problems that I always face is that anytime I want to offer information and I find something in a book and it conflicts with something that the Beatles have said, how do you know what is the accurate information?
Yes. Well, inevitably when you're writing a biography or history, you're going to get conflicting points of view. But this is my subject. I've been a Beatles historian now for 30 odd years. It's all I do. I don't have a day job. I am a Beatles historian.
It's not a bad job.
No, it's the best.
Want to trade?
It's And I mean, it really is a long day job. I work very long hours all the time at this.
Yeah.
But you get a very strong sense of what's right and what isn't right, and what's believable and what isn't believable. But every once in a while, inevitably, you're going to come up with a situation where 2 or 3 people, each categorically, their account of it is categoric but contradictory. And in such instances, it's not really for me to decide. I can perhaps tilt the writing one way or the other, but I actually put all the conflicting versions in.
That's kind of the way to do it, because one of the things that I admire about your work is that you don't taint it with your opinion.
Yes. I'm not in this book. All I'm doing is weaving it together, and the knowledge on the Beatles is tremendously deep. And again, without wishing to sound dismissive of them, the likes of Hunter Davis and Philip Norman and so on, they're not interested in the deeper levels of information. They have a project in mind. I'm going to write a book on the Beatles. I'm going to give it 2 years. They do 6, 7, 8 months of research, 6, 7, 8 months of writing. It goes into production. It comes out.
Right.
You can't do that with the Beatles. There's far too much to know and to learn. I mean, stuff is coming up all the time that needs to be processed. There are so many levels of information, and no matter how deep some of those levels are, they're still interesting, they're still relevant, and all that needs to be assessed. Well, you can't do that in a year or two. This first volume has taken 10 years.
Wow. So you weren't given any deadline at all?
When I signed the contracts for these books, we had to put a date down. And it was a fairly arbitrary thing, but I had a feeling it could be done in about 4 or 5 years. So that I started the project in 2003. The contract had delivery as 2007 with publication in 2008. Well, in 2007, I hadn't even started writing yet. I was still doing the research. And that was on top of a lifetime of other research, because I've been researching this since the 70s. And I was still finding good stuff out, still meeting people who had never been interviewed before, who told fantastic things. And I just thought, the very nature of this project is we're cutting no corners. This will never be done as thoroughly. It's never been done this thoroughly before. It won't be done this thoroughly again, because the people won't be around to be involved in it anymore. And so let's not cut any corners. And the publishers understood that. That's what they bought into. So I told them then I was going to be late, and they accepted that. And then it took a very long time to write. It took just over 3 years to write every day.
Mm-hmm.
So again, that pushed the deadline further and further back. We didn't exactly make announcements, but we would say every once in a while, or I would say, I hope to get it out in 2011, but it would pass. And it just took as long as it needed to take. That's as simple as it is. I mean, the great thing about this is that most projects do have that commercial imperative where you've got to meet this deadline and it's got to be out for that anniversary. But the publishers understood with this that isn't what it's about. It's about just doing it properly, and when you finished it, then we'll publish it.
You found the right publisher.
I did, yeah.
This was Crown?
Crown in the US
Yes.
and Little Brown in the UK. And they've both been fantastically patient. And volumes 2 and 3 are still to go, but they won't take as long. They won't be quick, but they won't take as long as this one took. I mean, this one covers a very broad span of time, and the next two have a much narrower focus in terms of the years that they cover. The story has been written chronologically, and this first volume goes up to the end of 1962.
What interests me the most, and you've partially answered this anyway, is there anything that you've uncovered that conflicts with the way the Beatles have told their own story? And, there are some people who believe no matter what, you got to go by what they say. I mean, who knows better than them?
Yes. Well, that's true to a certain extent. I mean, their line is always, which I understand, there were only 4 of us in the car.
Right.
Or 4 of us in the van, or whatever it might be. And I understand exactly why they say that, and I respect it. But actually, there are times when there were others in the van as well, and in the car, and I've got some of those people, and you really are right in there with them. But more to the point is that because there were just the 4 of them, they have a level of knowledge, such as it might still exist, which we can't know. Because it is truly private to them, and that's fair enough, and in fact that's right. That's the way it should be. But there's also many other dimensions to their story that they don't know about at all. I mean, they don't know, for example, how they got a recording contract. To this day, they'll find out when they read the book. I'm not going to tell you either, but it's in the book.
Okay, there's more to it than we've heard all this time.
Yes.
Beyond the audition with George Martin.
Yes, there was no audition for George Martin, but beyond that, I'm not going to say anything more. I mean, there've been so many uncertain factors about the Beatles in terms of the early part of their story. It's just never been told properly before. It's as simple as that. It really hasn't been told properly before, and it needs to be told properly while we have the opportunity to do it.
Is there anything that you can tell us this early on that you've uncovered that hasn't been discovered until now?
No, not really. I mean, the publishers are on at me all the time can we leak this, can we put this out on Twitter, can we Facebook that, and can we, put out a press release about this? And I'm saying, it's a book. Let's read the book. Things belong in the book in terms of their context, and the moment you extract it from the book and make a separate thing of it, you've lost you can't possibly give the full context anymore.
Right.
But it's a combination, as I've been saying all along, it's a combination of things that we have never known before, with things that we kind of did know, or maybe if you've read all the books you might have retained a memory of, but didn't quite understood how it fitted into the bigger picture. So now it all makes sense. And the whole story is much more human and real now than it's ever been before.
If I mention certain topics, can you tell us if you've discovered a lot more about that we have never heard before? At least point us in that direction?
Try me.
How about the firing of Pete Best?
Yes. It's nailed once and for all. I mean, I'm astonished that it's been this unknown for 50 years.
So there's more to it than just George Martin didn't like him at the June 6th audition?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But actually, I mean, it's overwhelmingly obvious why he was sacked. It's overwhelmingly obvious. And actually, we've kind of known it all along, but never really... We've always felt that there had to be more to... There are certain things that people think, there must be more to it than that. And whatever it is that there is that we don't know is I'm making a convoluted sentence out of this, but I'm basically trying to say that people think sometimes there's more to something than there is.
Okay.
The reasons why he was sacked are overwhelmingly clear throughout the book.
There are theories that Spencer Lee has talked about, so I'm wondering if any of that leaks into...
People have found the truth already, but also found a whole lot of other things that have skewed the picture unnecessarily. But the truth has been known all along.
I know that I've interviewed Pete several times, and every time I ask the question, he says to me, I really don't know why.
Well, I don't know why he says that, because he was told why he was sacked.
Okay.
Yeah.
And isn't it also true that...
I mean, they didn't really want Pete in the first place. They didn't want him. Even when they were desperate to have a drummer and knew that he was up there with a kit in his mum's house in West Derby, in north end of Liverpool, they only went for him when they really had no other choice.
Well, they needed him for Hamburg.
Yes, but they needed a drummer before that as well, and not looked in his direction.
Still, you could say, why would they keep him for 2 years if they didn't like him?
Several reasons for that, all of which are thoroughly explained.
Okay. Isn't it also true that the Beatles were considering other drummers besides Ringo?
No, they weren't. Certain approaches were made to other people for certain pragmatic reasons, but Ringo was the only one they wanted.
Because I know I've spoken to David Bedford. I don't know how much you're familiar with his work, but he said the Beatles definitely were considering Johnny Hutchinson.
No. There was pragmatically there was a possibility that they could use him for a while. Ringo was the only one they wanted. He was the only one they asked to do it. Brian did make approaches to others for certain pragmatic reasons, but they didn't work out anyway.
Okay.
But there was no way that they would have had Johnny Hutch in the band. Absolutely no way.
Well, I'm just saying, based on a lot of what I'm relaying to you is what I get from other interviews that I've done.
Yeah.
And David Bedford has done a lot of research, and I really love his book, Liverpool, a lot. And he told me that Johnny Hutch was considered the best drummer in Liverpool.
John said that he was the best drummer in Liverpool and Ringo was second best, but it wasn't just about that. It was about personality. And Johnny Hutch and the Beatles were a very bad fit.
And Ringo.
He hated them. Hutch hated them.
Yeah.
And they knew he hated them too.
Yeah. Is there anything about, probably the most interesting part of the whole Beatles story is the relationship between John and Paul. What I'm most intrigued about is that all these years, you know, you look at all the Lennon-McCartney songs, and you know in the very beginning, certain songs like From Me to You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, those songs were 50-50 collaborations, and gradually one guy wrote most of the song and the other one contributed a little bit.
Yeah.
And that's how it was, with the exception of We Can Work It Out and A Day in the Life and those songs.
Yes.
Is there more to it than that? And the reason that I'm bringing that up is because there was a book that Julia Baird put out recently, and there's a CD of an interview with Paul McCartney in there where he kind of says there's a lot more to it. There was more give and take than people realize.
Yes.
So did John and Paul contribute more to each other's songs than we're led to believe?
Well, obviously we're talking here beyond where the first volume ends. We're talking into the later period beyond 62.
Right.
Right. No, I think that I know why he's saying that, because very little was ever 100 of this and 0, 100% and 0%.
Right.
There was always a level of collaboration, even if it was just changing a word or a line or running something past the other one. But obviously it varies from song to song. I don't think there's any great thing that we don't know about when it comes to the division of the songwriting labour for the later years.
Yeah.
But I mean, I can, in the first volume, will shed another light on that, in that they started writing separately. That's the first thing. Then they came together, but even as soon as they had started to come together to write, they were writing separately again. I mean, One After 909 is John's song. I'll Follow the Sun is Paul's. Love of the Loved is Paul's. Like Dreamers Do is Paul's. They're not 50-50s. They were doing that even at the start.
I'm pretty sure
writing some together and writing some separately.
I'm pretty sure I saw a quote from Paul where he said that he and John wrote One After 909. And unless you're there as they're writing it, how do you know for sure? The only people you really can rely on are those two people. And one of them, unfortunately, is gone.
Yeah.
So,
John always said it was his, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. And we also have that conversation from the Get Back sessions. We have a tape of it where Paul is going, I never understood that line. And he questions what the meaning of the lyric, because it doesn't quite make sense. Which also seems to suggest that he didn't have a part in it at the time. But you're absolutely right, unless you're in the room. I mean, I've written this book with the absolute, every little piece of research has gone into making sure that this text is as accurate as possible. But it's still imperfect, because I wasn't there. And even those who were there, well, it's 50 odd years ago now. So, it's still the best I can possibly make it. I've striven for perfection, but you can't actually attain it.
Not only that,
just get close.
Aren't there also problems with certain people that you've interviewed that have played some part in Beatle history that want to really elevate their status?
Oh yeah, and it's up to authors to ensure that they don't get what they want.
Right.
And there are unfortunately too many authors who just will very happily take all the stuff they're given without challenging it. You've got to challenge all these things, and unless something completely fits into the framework of the story, you can't use it. I mean, if someone says something that is so patently wrong, the alarm bells start going. You just go, no, I can't use that.
Right.
No matter how nice a story that is, I can't use that. And unfortunately, that stricture, that discipline, isn't always applied by people. It ought to be, but it isn't.
Okay.
Because people do have a tendency to enlarge. I mean, some people make almost a living out of it.
Outside of the titles of those early Lennon-McCartney songs, many of which you've written about in the Beatles Live, and are there other songs that you may have found out about that John and Paul wrote together or wrote separately early on?
No, I've pulled together every title, but I'm not the first to have done that. No, I haven't found. I found one or two. I found an early recording that we did, a couple of early recordings, and various gigs that were recorded in Liverpool in 61, 62, which we don't have tapes for.
Right.
But I now know more about the fact that they were recorded.
Is there a lot more that you've uncovered since you've done the Beatles Live about those early performances before they were famous?
Yeah.
that you didn't know about before.
Yeah, I've found out just in the process of writing this book, I found another 3 or 4 that I didn't know about. There was never a definitive list. So, all I did in all those years ago was research as many as I could. And where there were gaps in the schedule, you'd think, well, maybe they had a day off here, or maybe there's one I don't know about. And, there have been a few more coming up, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling to think all the research put into that. And unless there's facts out there to back them up, how do you even know?
Yeah.
The Beatles didn't keep a diary.
Yeah. There's all sorts of... I mean, I remember there's one in particular, back in about 1982, there was a British fan magazine called Beatles Now, and it had an interview with the man who was the DJ at a date the Beatles played in the East End of London, an area called Leighton, in sometime in around the period when From Me to You came out, April 1963. And they were really big by then. And so I immediately thought, well, I've got to find, I know they played there now, here's the guy talking about it, but what was the date? And he didn't have it in the piece. And I did everything I could to find out the date of that, and I just couldn't. It was not advertised anywhere. Clearly, they just put a poster up, and that was enough for the thing to sell out, so there was no need to run a newspaper ad. I'd never seen a ticket or a handbill or anything like that, so I just did not know the date of it. Until I eventually found someone who used to go to Leighton Baths to this ballroom, and he would go there regularly. And I said to him, when did they have rock shows on there? And he said it was always a Friday night. It was always a Friday night. Only ever saw bands there on a Friday night. So there was one gap in April of 1963. There was a Friday night, and I thought, well, it's got to be that. I had nothing else to go on, so I put that in as the date. And then eventually, about 10 years later, after the Complete Beatles Chronicle came out, I found a Brian Epstein document, Beatles instructions for the week. Those lovely documents that Brian used to give them every week of where they were playing and what kind of instructions that they might need to know about. And it was on a Monday night. And there it was, and it was on a Monday night, and I was wrong. My book was wrong. And this guy who had told me, sworn that it was only ever on a Friday, and I just thought, you need to see documents. And the whole thing about this book I've written, and the 2 to come, is documentary research. Documents are my number one interest in terms of Beatle collecting. I'm not so much interested in memorabilia or merchandising. I've even don't buy so many records these days. I've kind of got all that. Information is what I collect, and mostly that comes from documents. And I don't need to own the original. I just need to see it, to make notes from it, to photograph it, to photocopy it, scan it, anything I can do. Just get the content of that information, of that document, a letter, a contract, anything at all. And that is the absolute bedrock of this first volume, is documentation, and will be for the next 2 as well. Okay. Because it's not wrong. And then on top of that, you can put all the colour, if you like, but you've got that absolutely solid piece of information there, a letter that was written, it's dated, and you've got it. Okay.
Because he recently passed away, just want your thoughts about the importance of what Tony Sheridan was to the Beatles.
Yeah, well, Sheridan was... He was big for them. They knew him already when they went out to Hamburg in 1960, and Sheridan was already there. They were really impressed to meet him because they had seen him on television. There were very few rock and roll TV shows in the 1950s. The first one in England was called 6-5 Special, and then the man who made that, Jack Good, defected to the commercial channel, ITV, and made this show called Oh Boy. And Oh Boy was a very exciting rock and roll TV show. It was the first time. Good was really fantastic in projecting the sheer excitement of this new music, and Tony Sheridan was the resident guitarist on there. Sheridan was the first man who ever played guitar, electric guitar, and sang on TV at the same time. A real first. And I'm not too sure that anyone in America came before that. And actually play. Don't mean miming, I mean really playing. So they knew he was good, and when they got out to Hamburg, he was there. So they were very impressed to meet him. they instantly found that he was quite a difficult guy, Sheridan. He made as many enemies as he made friends. He was very temperamental. But all the same, they were pretty raw when they went out there, and he was an influence on them, particularly George's guitar work, and particularly the way John stood at the microphone was his own style, but it was kind of modelled on the way Tony Sheridan stood.
Right. And we've heard that he taught the Beatles, well, specifically George, a lot of different chords on the guitar.
Yeah. They had even seen Tony Sheridan, one of the big British rock and roll tours before the Beatles went to Hamburg, when they were just about becoming the Beatles, was when Gene Vincent and Eddie Cochran toured Britain. It was the tour when Cochran got killed. And they didn't all go, but John and George certainly, and I think Stuart, with girlfriends, went to see Cochran and Vincent at Liverpool Empire, and Sheridan was on the bill. So I think he opened the show. So again, they knew him, they respected him. So he did pass on lots of bits of information, but at the same time, they quickly got the measure of him, because he was the kind of guy who, I think Ringo says it in that new photographs book, or in the video, the e-book, he does some stories, because he played with Sheridan as well in Hamburg, and they'd be playing away, and Sheridan would see someone talking to his girlfriend, and right there in the middle of the song, he'd jump down from the stage, smash the guy's face in, maybe come back covered in blood, and carry on playing the song. I mean, it was he was quite a character, and they, as ever with the Beatles, they took. But they didn't stay. They were never stuck. The Beatles. I mean, Sheridan, you could argue, especially since he had the Beatles Association. Once they became big, he became known as the man who had worked with them and recorded with them.
Right.
And he never really got himself beyond that. Whereas, of course, they moved on. They just moved on. And by the time they were in Hamburg in '62, Sheridan's still there. There's no real association anymore.
And as the Beatles legend grew and grew, it's hard to ever surpass that,
even
if you have the slightest bit of history with them.
Well, this is it. Anyone who's had any association with the Beatles always finds that it's the biggest thing ever in their career, whether they like it or not, and quite often they don't. I mean, Richard Lester, the film director, refers to A Hard Day's Night as the elephant in the room of his career. But, he knows that when he dies, it's going to be Beatles film director dies. He said that.
Right.
And, that's galling when you've made a lot of great films.
Look at George Martin. I mean, George Martin has accomplished so much beyond the Beatles.
Yeah.
But he's always going to be known for that.
Yeah. I mean, the Beatles story is so huge that it just tends to dominate everything.
Yeah. I actually had the privilege of interviewing Tony in 1992, and I put it on my website, and it was a lot better than I remembered it. Yeah. But it was nice. I did go through just about all the songs that he recorded with the Beatles, just to have some soundbite for each song. But he was very interesting and very candid, and I thought he was pretty eccentric.
Yeah, you could get very good interviews from him,
yeah.
but he could also be very difficult.
Of all the songs that John and Paul wrote together, the ones that have the most controversy are In My Life and Eleanor Rigby, because John and Paul have given different stories for both and how much each one's contributed to both. Is there anything that you found out about the writing of those two songs?
Some, yes, but that's for volume 2.
Okay. Will we have a much clearer understanding of how much?
So. The Eleanor Rigby is the really surprising one, because various people claim to have contributed to that.
No, I've heard that George Harrison, came up with the line, "I'll look at all the lonely people."
Yeah.
Is that true?
I don't know, but I'll know by the time I come to write about it.
Okay.
I'm not going to say I know things if I don't. I mean...
Right, I appreciate that.
Yeah, I have vast archives of research that will hopefully guide me to the right answer. If I haven't found, something new on it, I'll be able to work out what it was.
And Paul has said that he wrote at least part of the melody for In My Life.
Yeah.
Which I find rather interesting, because I've never known there to be an instance where Paul just writes the melody or just writes the lyrics, or either one of them for that matter. Yes. It was never one writes the lyrics, one writes the melody.
They were writing a fair bit together in that period in late '65. And also the idea for Penny Lane came up then, because it was originally the first draft of In My Life lyric, right? That mentioned Penny Lane. And they did an interview, I think it was Paul did an interview with the NME saying that we like the poetry of names like Penny Lane. So, may do something with, with that in mind. So I think he may have been, I think he was probably around John when John was writing In My Life and may have contributed. But I can't be, without my notes in front of me, I can't be sure. I mean, there's just so much of this to retain in one's head.
Right.
And my focus has been the pre-63 period, really.
Okay.
After this, it'll shift to the next period.
So can I still ask anything past 63?
Yes, you can, but you can stick to the earlier period as well.
Okay. There are just a few key things that I wanted to bring up, because one thing that I'm not sure if it's ever been written about. The 3 George Harrison Indian songs, Love You Too, Within You Without You, and The Inner Light, who actually wrote the arrangements of the Indian instruments? Because that's so much a vital part of the song. When I hear the beginning of Love You Too, that's brilliant. And I don't know if George came up with that or if he just said to the musicians,
yes,
you improvise, you come up with whatever. I've never seen anything in writing.
No, nor have I.
Oh, wow.
No one's ever been credited, no one's claimed it, and no one's ever said who did it. You would imagine that on Love You Too, for example, that would be probably written on acoustic guitar, wouldn't it? Sounds like an acoustic guitar composition. And then obviously it would get embellished from that point onwards. I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know. I'll try and find out.
Because I know George Martin has talked about how he came up with the strings for Within You Without You, but as far as the Indian instruments, who came up with those?
And even on Within You Without You, he was responding to the arrangement was already there, wasn't he? With his conventional string arrangement.
Yeah, so he wanted to have like a crying sound like the Indian instruments had.
Yes.
Okay.
And the pizzicato strings, but no, I don't know. I'll find out. I'll try to find out anyway.
Is there anything?
There's so much to know.
Oh, I know. It's endless.
Really is. Yeah.
For such a short period of time, this body of work, it goes on and on. The conversations of what you can learn.
And people say, "Oh, you must know all there is to know about the Beatles," and of course, no one does. No one knows all there is to know about anything.
But you're as close as you can get.
Well, I know a lot. Obviously, I know a lot, and I have archives of information that can tell me things like now that I haven't immediately got at my fingertips. But all the same, it isn't complete.
Right.
And as George Harrison would say and did say, you weren't there.
Right.
So, you have to be mindful of that. If someone was writing my life story, well, they might have all my diaries and they might have all the letters I've ever written and tapes like this in which I'm speaking, but it wouldn't quite be right. So you just have to do your best, really. But it's, as I say, strive for perfection, knowing that you probably can't attain it. But if you don't strive for it, you won't even get close. So you've got to strive for it. But it's a terribly hard thing to write the life story of different people. Mm-hmm. I mean, this first volume is the life story of several different people, all woven together. Beatle books tend to write about them as if they were one person, but that's ridiculous. I mean, they were different people who each brought something different to the team, right. And Brian Epstein and George Martin similarly.
Is there anything, since I just brought up George Harrison, that you can say about, over the years, you always hear amongst fans that George was so frustrated being in the Beatles, he was held back, he had 2 songs per album, blah, blah, blah. And yet recently, Olivia Harrison made some quote where she said, "Stop feeling so sorry for George. He loved being in the Beatles." From everything that you've researched, was he really frustrated? Or was this more, did he like being, if you will, second-class Beatle? Because, he may have been comfortable in that role anyway.
The point about George is when he joined John and Paul, they opened the door for him and then closed it behind him, as it were. So he was always one of the 3. But he could see that John and Paul were, eager to push themselves forward. They wanted to be the front guy, and it was actually in George's nature to step back a little bit, and from there you have a different view. If you've stepped back slightly, you can see to the left and to the right, and you can see the people in front of you, and you're closer to what's behind you. I think that was quite I mean, George couldn't compete with John and Paul in terms of ego, at least to the extent that they were projecting theirs. He had one of his own, of course, but I think he was comfortable in his position. And when they carved up the songwriting, which they pretty much did, as he put it, it became Beatles first class and Beatles second class with him and Ringo. And that must have grated sometimes, but it also afforded him the luxury of not having to be the front guy, which wasn't necessarily in his nature as much as it was in John and Paul's. Most of the stuff that we say about George that you were quoting just now does come from George, doesn't it? He talks about his frustration that he could only get a couple of songs on each album, but really before then he didn't have the material to compete with them anyway, and not only quality wise but quantity wise. I mean, his first song was Don't Bother Me, 1963. Well, Lennon and McCartney were well established, they were writing number ones by then. And then after that the next one was You Know What to Do, which was not a strong song, and he didn't write another one until the early 65 for the Help album. So by which point Lennon and McCartney were the most famous composers in the world.
But by the end of the Beatles, he certainly was extremely prolific.
He was.
With so much of All Things Must Pass having been written during his time with the Beatles.
He's talked about those frustrations, so I understand why Olivia says what she says. And I'm glad she said that, but a lot of our knowledge does come from what George himself said. But one of the nice things I found in the early days is once Brian took over the Beatles management, George had equal stage time with John and Paul. I didn't actually realise that until I was writing this book. And though that was almost certainly Brian's idea, it wouldn't have happened without John and Paul accepting it, because a lot of people don't understand the role that Brian Epstein played as the Beatles manager, but one of them was that he could suggest things, but he certainly couldn't compel them to do anything, because you couldn't tell John or Paul what to do. You just couldn't. You could guide them to an idea, and if they saw the sense of it, they would go with it, but if they didn't want to do it, they would tell you.
One thing about Brian, and this is one thing that has stood out in my memory from many years ago when I interviewed Ray Coleman, he said, and this is when he put out his book on Brian, that by the time the Beatles did their audition for EMI...
Which they didn't.
Well, all right. Keep correcting me on that. Sounds good. He was ready to throw in the towel if the Beatles hadn't gotten a record contract by then, because he'd already tried all the other record companies. So is there anything that you have to prove that was true?
I'm sure that he wouldn't have thrown in the towel. Yeah, I remember Ray saying that, but there's nothing I've found that suggests that would have been the case. They would have been at the end of a road, however, and the way forward would have been unclear. But he had just got a contract with them, and such was his belief in them, it would have been a big stumbling block, of course. But I don't believe he would have chucked it in at that point. The chucking in actually was going to come just before they met Brian. A lot of people say, would the Beatles have made it without Brian? The reality is, without Brian, they would have broken up.
Very interesting the way you word that. But I've often said that, the two most important people in Beatle history outside of the four of them, if you want to call them fifth Beatles, are Brian and George Martin.
Yeah.
And how could the Beatles have ever happened without those two?
Well, they were certainly happening anyway. I mean, from a strictly factual point of view, they were happening already. But if you mean happening on a global scale,
right,
then it wouldn't have happened without Brian, and it would have been very different without George Martin. They could have done something with another producer, but he was the only man who was a maverick like they were on the London record scene at the time they came up.
He was also the perfect producer for them.
Oh, completely. Completely. But he was also the only one with the desire to be different.
Right.
Most people just followed a formula. And there was also the whole thing, because I do tell the story of the music business quite thoroughly in both British and American music businesses. I tell in this book, because my premise is, we all know that the Beatles, it's always said they changed everything, the Beatles. As soon as they came along, the whole business changed, for artists, and the way the record companies ran, and the whole broadcasting of popular music changed as well. So really, they were the great revolutionary force throughout the whole gamut of pop rock music. If that's true, we need to look at what it was like before they came along, and how they changed it, and what it was like after they changed it. So I tell a very contextual story of the music business in Britain and America before the Beatles, so that we see what kind of a business it was that they joined when they joined it in 1962. And at that time, the big thing, certainly in England, was for record producers to insert their name in as co-composers of songs, or to insist that their song is on the B-side or even the A-side of their artist's recording.
Like Norman Petty would do.
Yeah, and in England, Norrie Paramore was the big one who was doing that, a Cliff Richard's producer. George Martin was one of the very few who didn't do that. Well, that was very lucky.
Right.
The Beatles story does have a lot of luck, but in the end, you realise it has so much luck at almost every turn that it's just like, well, it was something about them that was causing it to happen.
Right.
I mean, there's so many phenomenal coincidences and pieces of good fortune in the Beatles story. They happen all the time,
which a lot of people don't realize. I mean, you could be the most talented group in the world and still not get anywhere if you don't have the right breaks at the right time.
Yeah.
And meet the right people. And the Beatles were lucky to do that.
Yeah, and it happened right from the start. Really, right from the start.
When you say start, what point are you talking about when you say...
1960, from then onwards, basically.
Are you talking about someone like Alan Williams? Or
Yeah, okay. I am actually, yeah. Alan has got a very strange reputation in the Beatles world now. He's become a bit of for a long time he's been a kind of a laughing stock. And quite often that's because he has projected that image of himself. But actually he was completely vital. He calls himself a tiny cog in the story, which is quite bashful of him, really. But all the same, the word cog is the key one, because if you've got something that's working really well, a machine, a clock, and the cog is missing, it doesn't work. It stops.
Without him, they wouldn't have gone to Hamburg.
Precisely. The whole Hamburg thing wouldn't have happened without Alan Williams.
Right.
And he didn't design it that way, but certainly he was the one who made it happen. He was a go-getter, as people used to say in those days. He made things happen just through his own energy and his own adventurous spirit. You know, what a weird thing to do, to go over to Hamburg and to see if he could take Liverpool groups over there. I mean, the Liverpool rock and roll scene was barely up and running at that point.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it was just about, it was there, but the groups didn't know the existence of the other groups until Alan Williams started bringing it all together. And then he drops out. By 61, he's dropped out.
Any other unsung heroes that maybe you want to bring up in Beatle history that should get a lot more credit that haven't?
Not quite going to answer that precisely, but one of the things that's going to make my book of interest to people are talking heads in it who many readers will never have heard of, who actually were really, they're not necessarily central to the events, but they were direct first-hand witnesses to events, who have not been interviewed before. And that the general point that I could make about this is that there are certain people who, if you're writing a Beatle book, you have to go and interview them. And you see their names, they crop up in every book. And that has two effects. First of all, it makes that person appear far more important and central to events than they actually were, because they're always the ones that are being quoted about it. But secondly, it clamps down the subject, because when a person's being interviewed for the 500th time, what on earth are they going to say that they haven't said in the previous 499? And what on earth is that writer's book going to have that's different to all the other books?
Right.
It can't possibly be different. In fact, the only way it could be different is if the person, the interviewee, makes something up that he hasn't said in the others. Otherwise, if he just tells what actually happened, well, he's told it 499 times already.
Right.
My premise is: are they the only people to interview? And the answer to that is absolutely not. There are so many other great people to interview who've never been interviewed, who are not part of this story seemingly, and yet they really were. Because there are, for every person who is always sticking their hand up saying, I was there, come and interview me. There are, by nature, other people who don't put their hand up, but they were there, and you just have to go and find them. And if the time is right in their life, when they're ready to talk about it, they will talk about it. And if the approach is right and sincere, and if you promise them that you will, be respectful of their story and so on, they will open up. And there are some fantastic first-hand quotes in this book. I mean, really fantastic quotes from people who were unquestionably there, and it's all genuine and believable and real and strong and human. And it's just like, goodness me, I never even heard of this person before. So there's a lot of that.
Yeah. Did you happen to interview any of the Beatles for this book?
No.
Did you feel there wasn't a need to, or?
There were certain key things I would like to have asked. I had a little bit of email help from Paul on specific questions that I asked him, which was nice because he didn't have to do that. But otherwise, no. But I have interviewed Paul about 15 times in years gone by, very little of which has ever been seen before. And these were interviews done when he was younger.
Right.
And the events that he was describing were more recent than they are now.
Right.
So there's some amazing McCartney stuff in this book that is exclusive to this book, but he didn't tell me for this book.
Right.
But he's just told me, and I've never used it. So it's all in there. But all the central characters are constantly in it, because another thing that no Beatle writers, certainly the biographers, never go near is all the archive stuff. I mean, the Beatles were interviewed constantly from 1963, either in terms of actual audio recordings from radio or television, or from tours or press conferences, but also print interviews that, are fairly faithful verbatim print interviews. That material is relatively untouched. Okay. And there's so much of it. There really is.
Even though it is a well-worn subject, any subject with the Beatles is fascinating. So, whenever I've had a discussion about the Beatle breakup, I've always said there were many reasons why.
Yeah.
But the one thing that people will debate upon is what was the biggest reason. Based on everything that you've learned about them, what would you say was the single biggest reason why they broke up?
Simply because they've been doing it all those years. I mean,
they'd grown tired of it?
It was in their natures that they would break up. I think they started to break up the moment they got together.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a powerful statement. Why would you say that?
Because it was in their nature. I think in John Lennon's nature particularly, that he was never going to do any one thing forever. And that he would take it and enjoy it and see where it went and go with it and use it for whatever means or needs that he had. But ultimately, he would never do any one thing forever. Everything about John Lennon's character and nature, personality would tell us that. Everything we know.
Very interesting answer. Talk a little bit about the White Album. The reason why I'm bringing it up is because recently I had the chance to interview Ken Scott.
Yeah.
Very interesting interview. And he shed some insight on it that I hadn't thought about before, because all that I had heard about the recording of the White Album was that, they certainly weren't a close group while it was going on. You had one Beatle in one studio recording one song, another one in another studio. And he said to me, well, people don't realize it. They were under contract to record 2 albums. They had a deadline. That's why they were recording in different studios at the same time. But for Ken, it was a very enjoyable experience. It wasn't this big, tense album, although Paul said it was a tense album.
Well, they all said, the Beatles themselves all said, they all said pretty negative things about the sessions, didn't they? And there's no question that they were having very tense times during some of the sessions. With anything in life, it's very rarely 100% of this and 0% of the other. You get, it's a blend, it's a spectrum, and obviously it was a tense album, but you can look at photographs and see them smiling, and you can hear outtakes and hear them having a good time.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that the sessions were wholly happy either. So I would say that on the spectrum of, where you've got hard left and hard right, the needle is more towards unhappiness than happiness, but not all the way. So someone like Ken could have no doubt had some interesting and fun times on the sessions, because I'm sure they were there to be had. But the overwhelming picture you get from everything you ever hear them say about the White Album, and after all, principally it's about their relationship at this time that album was made, then they were having difficulties.
It's a fascinating thing. They'll all give you different opinions at the same time. Ringo has said that he felt the Beatles are more of a band during the White Album.
Yeah, well, and certainly...
As opposed to Sgt. Pepper.
Yeah, because, I mean... pretty much they did basic tracks for all those songs,
right?
In the traditional, 3 guitars and drums format or something like that. Certainly with him there playing on most of the takes or all the takes. So yeah, I could understand why he would say that. But that was also the sessions when he quit. And which was the sessions that George used to describe as the low of all time? It was Let It Be, wasn't it?
Yeah, Let It Be.
Yeah, but you could look at bits of the Let It Be film and see George laughing.
You can listen to Beatle bootlegs of Let It Be, and they're laughing at certain times.
Yeah. So again, there is this tendency to talk about them as a band as if they've got one personality, but there's 4 there, and just with a look, just the way that people interact, just with a look or a comment or a word, that can turn the mood of something up or down. And there's no question that though it was a very creative time for them, at the same time it was an unhappy period.
There's so many reasons why I love this book, but most of all, I feel like I'm living with them as I'm reading each page. And it's like, if you could do it, if you had all the information of what went on in a particular week, you knew what was going on with John that week, what was going on with Paul that week, you could have taken a different approach. You could have went chapter 1, John 1940 to 1957.
Yes.
Same thing with Paul, 42 to 57, but you didn't. So I really feel like I'm with them as I'm reading this book. But we're going to start by doing something which is different for me because I like to do everything chronologically. But considering the fact that this is, to me, the biggest bombshell in the book, I thought I'd try to get as much as I can of you talking about it, which is how the Beatles got their record contract with EMI.
Right.
Now, the way that I read it, and I might be misunderstanding this, it really was the result of the fact that the publishing arm of EMI, Ardmore and Beechwood, was interested in the song Like Dreamers Do, and they wanted the publishing rights for that. But how could that turn into a recording contract with the group?
Yes. This all goes back a very long way for me because when I wrote the Recording Sessions book in 87, 88, the thinking then was that the Beatles' first visit to Abbey Road on the 6th of June, 62, was an audition, and it's been described as an audition forever, everywhere. But in 1991, 3 years after that book was published, I should say that at Abbey Road, the paperwork for the very first session was quite thin. Very thin, in fact, just the tape log. So I had nothing more to go on that session. There was even a certain uncertainty about which studio it was in. When 3 years after the book I gained access to another archive within EMI, I found all the paperwork that related to the issuing of their recording contract. And the first thing that leapt out at me was the fact that they had been given this contract before their first session. And their first session was not an audition, but it was actually a session under a contract. And at that time I was working with George Martin a lot on different things, one of which was the Making of Sgt. Pepper TV documentary. Mm-hmm. And we were spending a fair bit of time together. And one day I took photocopies of all these documents from my archive in to show George and spread them all out in front of him. And I said, "Can you explain this to me? Because you appear to have signed them before you ever saw them." And he looked at them and he appeared genuinely bewildered as to what these documents were trying to tell him. And he said, "Well, why would I have done that? Why would I have signed them?" And I was going, "I don't know, George, you tell me." And we left the room that day without an answer. And I tried to work my way into an answer for the Chronicle that came out that year, 1992. But it still didn't satisfy me. I still felt there was more to this story than met the eye. And the key was turned for me on this project for Tune In when I finally found, after years of looking for him, a man called Kim Bennett. Actually, that wasn't his real name, that was his professional name when he had been a singer. You can find Kim Bennett records on eBay from time to time. Late 1950s on Decca. He was working as professional manager or plugger, song plugger, at Ardmore and Beechwood, as you say. And he heard, like Dreamers Do, from the Beatles' Decca test and liked it and wanted to publish it. But Brian Epstein made it clear to Ardmore and Beechwood that though their interest in the songs was pleasing, what he really wanted was a recording contract for this group. These songs would be recorded by them before anybody else. And at that time, he was finding it very difficult to get them a recording contract. So Kim Bennett came up with an idea, which was fairly unusual, which was that EMI should let them make the recording, if you like, and issue it on one of the EMI labels, but Ardmore and Beechwood would get the publishing on this song by getting it recorded, essentially. But this was not the way that things were usually done. So when they asked in Manchester Square, the headquarters of EMI, if it would be allowed, the answer came back no. And that appeared to be the end of that. Brian Epstein did meet George Martin amongst all the other A&R men, and George was not impressed with what he had heard of the Beatles. He heard, I think, Hello Little Girl and Till There Was You. And I've seen that record now. That's 78 with Brian's handwriting on it, pressed in the HMV shop. There is a copy in existence.
Wow.
And nothing more developed. Brian went back to Liverpool. Everybody had turned the Beatles down. They really pretty much had nowhere else to go. And then suddenly, in May 1962, Brian got a phone call from George Martin, or from EMI, saying, come down. And he went. He must have had some sense of what it was going to be about, because there's a letter from Brian written that week that suggests he could return from London with some good news. And he went down and met George Martin, and George Martin offered him a contract. So why is the question, that's the backstory to your question. And the answer is that through a combination of events, coincidence and otherwise, George Martin's arm was twisted into signing the Beatles. It was no skin off his nose. I mean, it wasn't his personal money that would be spent. It was the company money. But Len Wood, who was the managing director of EMI, was ultimately sympathetic to Ardmore and Beechwood's request that a record be made. And he chose George Martin for this because of a number of events which I outline in the book. I don't know how much you wanted me to give them away, but it was personal and business. And it owed to a fairly fractious relationship that George had with Len Wood, a contract renewal negotiation that had not been entirely happy for either side, although it had been signed. George almost didn't re-sign with EMI. George was not exactly staff. He was staff at EMI, but they were on 3-year contracts. So it wasn't just a permanent job forever. You would renegotiate the contract every 3 years.
But he was top man at Parlophone.
He was, but all the A&R men were on the same kind of contract. They were the guys who ran Columbia and HMV, they were all on contracts like that as well. And it also owed to, ultimately it owed to love, because George Martin was married with 2 children, but the marriage hadn't worked and he had moved out. His wife wouldn't grant him a divorce, and very, very discreetly, with the utmost of discretion, he and Judy Lockhart Smith were now going out. No one knew this. This was a real secret, because these were different times. This was not 2013. This was 1960, from 56 onwards, I think, through to 62, and then through to 66 when they got married. They're still together. Sure. But Len Wood, the managing director of EMI, was unhappy that George Martin was having an affair, if in the old-fashioned sense of the word, with his secretary, and just decided that with a combination of all these things, who would he choose to make this Beatles record? And he said, I'll give it to George Martin.
This is explosive.
It's all quite unlikely and fairly ridiculous and bizarre, but absolutely true. And in a way, since George Martin and Judy have been together so long, I mean, they've been married nearly 50 years now, and they have children and grandchildren. I'm not even sure if they have great-grandchildren. So it's actually rather beautiful in a way that by that kind of quirk of fate, the Beatles ended up with a recording contract.
But you're saying that Len Wood did this in part to please Ardmore and Beechwood,
yes,
but to spite George Martin.
Yeah, spite is probably the wrong word, but just to give him the chore, if you like.
Okay.
And George Martin, the paperwork is absolutely clear. The contract, he thought they were called the Beatles with 2 T's. That's how the contract was issued. And it was not only issued up to Liverpool for Brian Epstein to sign, it was received back in London and processed before the Beatles even set foot in EMI.
So we really have, Ardmore and Beechwood to thank.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. And ultimately they were sidelined after the first record. If you read the books, you will get the firm impression that Ardmore and Beechwood were useless and did nothing whatever to work Love Me Do. And George Martin then said to Brian, you should go to a publisher who's going to work a bit harder for you. But the irony of that is that Kim Bennett, who had started all of this, was the plugger for Love Me Do, and he worked incredibly hard to get it played. He even went to Germany to get a play, one single play, on BBC Radio back in Britain. And if that sounds strange, well, the explanation for that is in the book. I won't go into it here. But he worked incredibly hard, but they had been part of the process that caused George Martin to find the Beatles. I should stress, the moment George Martin met the Beatles, he knew they were different and special, and he wanted to work with them. But things did not fall properly into place until Ardmore and Beechwood had been kind of sidelined out of the picture. And the story just got rewritten from that point onwards.
If Ardmore and Beechwood were so interested in Like Dreamers Do, why didn't they force the group, or at least tell Brian, and Brian relay that back to the group, we need you to record Like Dreamers Do? How did they get to record the 4 songs that they did on June 6th?
Yeah, maybe there was a communication breakdown of some kind. I don't know, because they didn't do that. They didn't record it at EMI ever. They may have run through it possibly, but ultimately, once you get into the studio, the A&R guys will decide what the material is going to be. But they did insist that one of the 2 songs, or ideally both, should be Lennon and McCartney on the first record. And when the Beatles when they were made to record How Do You Do It, and actually it's a myth that they did dislike it, no doubt about that, but it's a myth that they didn't put any effort in. They actually did quite a good rearrangement of that song. When they went to George Martin at the end of that session and said, George, we really don't want you to put this out, he said, sorry, tough, it's going out. And they left Abbey Road that day thinking it would go out. And when within the following few days it got dropped, they assumed it was George Martin listening to their point of view and acceding that yes, okay, it's not quite your style, boys, you can do Love Me Do instead. That wasn't the case at all. He was forced to drop it by Ardmore and Beechwood, because having brought all this into fruition in the first place, they didn't want to be fobbed off with one B-side, which was Love Me Do. So, and also Dick James' music and Mitch Murray, the songwriter, they didn't want it to be the record either. So when, as I say, George Martin went back to Brian and said, you've got to come down again because we're not going to issue How Do You Do It, they just assumed George was a great, great guy. And of course he was a great, great guy, but he did want it out. He even tried to make it their second record.
It's also interesting that on that June 6th session, that 3 of the 4 songs were original, which took a lot of guts on the Beatles' part, because she would have thought, you do what the top men at the record company want you to do. And how was it chosen that it was Love Me Do, P.S. I Love You, and Ask Me Why?
Well, this is most peculiar. I think since the role of the A&R man, the R in A&R is repertoire, artists and repertoire, and that means you choose the music that your artist will sing. But I don't think any prior thought was given to that first session on June 6th other than come down and let's hear what you can do, because they'd never met him before and he had never met them. So they came down with their own songs, and 3 of the 4, as you say, were their own, John and Paul's own songs. But nothing from that session was issued anyway. So I don't know. It's all very strange. He brought them down to the studio without giving them a song to record, and I think that can only be because he wanted to hear what they could do. So George describing it as an audition, which he's always done for 51 years now, makes sense in the sense that he hadn't seen them before and he'd only heard a couple of tracks on record, didn't really like them very much. He needed to know what they were capable of. In his mind, in some way, it was like an audition, but the paperwork makes it clear it wasn't. And they ended up with Love Me. I mean, the Love Me Do was such a saga because they had 3 recording sessions to get that record out. There was the one on June 6th, there was the one on September 4 when they did How Do You Do It and Love Me Do. Nothing from June 6th was considered worthy of issue, mostly because of the drumming. So at the end of September 4, they've got 2 tracks. One of them gets kicked off. So they've only got 1 track after 2 sessions. So then they come down again a week later and they have a pretty good session with Andy White. Actually, they do. In an hour and a half or an hour and 3/4, they do 3 tracks. And that's where they begin to find their feet in the studio. But it's really, the George Martin Beatles relationship really begins in this book with a meeting, not a session, at EMI House in London on the 16th of November 62, when he has seen the lights. Love Me Do has, though he didn't like it, it's become a success. It's sustaining on the charts. He recognises that they're original and he recognises that they're strong-minded, and he decides right then and there, quite extraordinarily, to make an album. The myth is that they recorded the first album, Please Please Me, because the Please Please Me was a big hit as a single, but in fact the decision to make that album was even before Please Please Me, the single, was recorded. So he did tune in to the Beatles very, very quickly, George, but initially it was a difficult, uncertain relationship. It took a few months to actually settle down.
We're going to bounce around time-wise here, but a very important part of the story of any of them is the story of, as we've always heard, John having to choose at the age of 5 between his mother and his father.
Yeah.
And here in the book, you're breaking that myth that it never really happened that way. We've all seen Nowhere Boy, and he picks the father, he picks Alfred, and then he changes his mind as Julia starts to walk away and he's running after her, mommy, mommy. It was never like that.
No, it wasn't. This is something I think that it took root with the Hunter Davis book in 1968. He didn't actually describe the scene that you have, but he had the seed there of something which in the hands of other writers has become amplified. And it now has become just part of the story, as you've just described it. I was prepared to write that, but I found out, without any difficulty, the name of the man who was Alf Lennon's friend, Billy Hall, in whose house these events occurred in Blackpool in the north of England in 1946. And I checked into Billy Hall's likely age and found out that he was a fair bit younger than Alf Lennon, and that, who knows, there is a chance he may still be alive. No other author had bothered to look for him, and I just thought, well, it's got to be worth a try. And eventually, with just the way these things go when you're looking for someone, I found him. And I found him in New Zealand, in his, I can't remember exactly how old, maybe about 85 years old, something like that. I mean, these events were 1946, so that's 67 years ago. He was about 85, and he told me what happened. And what happened was a lot less sensational than the books and the films would tell you, which is that there was a meeting in the front room of his parents' house, where he was living as well, in Blackpool, and Julia and her boyfriend Bobby Dykins came up from Liverpool to fetch John back. Alf had left Liverpool with John, or Johnny as he was to some, for a few weeks. And the key point that Billy Hall remembered was that they agreed that John would return to Liverpool with his mother, and that she would look after him properly. That was Alf's
achievement of that meeting, that she would look after him properly. And Billy Hall remembered that very clearly, because Alf was pleased with himself that he had got her to agree to that. Because obviously he felt that she hadn't been looked after properly, or John hadn't been looked after properly before. But in fact what happened was Julia was already pregnant with what was then her third child, and she took John back to Liverpool and handed him over to Mimi. And Mimi raised him from that point onwards, because she had never really looked after John that much. She was around through John's formative years, but she parented John differently to how you might imagine, I suppose would be one way of putting it. She would eventually settle Julia into her longest relationship with Bobby Dykins, and they had 2 children together. And from talking to Julia Baird, she has only great things to say of her mother, and obviously I completely respect that. But what one hears from other sources is that with John, she was out and about a lot. She was a working mum, but her working life was evenings as well as daytimes, and Mimi had already filled the breach a few times beforehand in young John's life. He had kind of been passed around a bit.
I need to bring this up because in recent years, through various books, and I know I've mentioned David Bedford to you before, he has said that Mimi stole John away from Julia, where it's always been my impression from everything that I've read that Julia willingly gave John to Mimi.
How does someone steal a child away from its mother? I mean, the mother has primary right to any child, right? I mean, there's so much more to the story than that. I mean, I like and respect David very much, and I have his books, and I'm looking forward to the new one. But what he's doing there is he's repeating a line that is said by Julia Baird. That's Julia Lennon's daughter, one of her 3 daughters. And Julia Baird comes to this story with a great deal of bias, if you like. She wants to tell her mother's side of the story more than anything else, and I understand that. I'm not criticizing it for a moment. As a historian, though, I can't buy into such a distorted version of the events. It's a version of the events, but it's not the only one. Look, Julia was John's mother. The social services had already intervened in the case of this relationship. In Julia Baird's one of her books, she actually says, and I get this from her, not from anywhere else, that when Julia and Bobby Dykins were first together, and you know what it's like when a couple is first together, how often they're at it, right? John was in the same bed as them. Not the same room, but the same bed. And social services came in and took the child out of that situation and put him in a place where he would be looked after differently. And that was Mimi.
But Mimi instigated that, right?
Well, Mimi went there on the behalf of the child because she knew what the child was being exposed to.
Right.
I mean, thank goodness she did that. I mean, who would let a child be in a situation like that? Why was Julia allowing this to happen? Now, I wasn't there, and I'm not trying to be judgmental in any way at all, but I get that from Julia's own book, that there was one bed, and they were all sharing it. And that's not good. And that's from Julia. And this business of stealing, it doesn't enter into it. Mimi gave the child what he'd always lacked, which was an absolutely rock-solid place to live. She was never going to be out when John came home from school. She was always going to be there for him. She was going to be tough but fair with him and give him the kind of solidity that he had not experienced from either parent.
Okay. Not to belabor this point, but just recently I spoke with Tim Riley on this very subject, and he was saying there was a weird relationship between Julia and Mimi, kind of a competition between the two of them. And Mimi didn't like the fact that Julia was living with a man while still legally married to Alfred, and she wanted to take John away from that, to give him and I'm commending her for that.
Yeah, indeed. But I mean, I pose the question again. I mean, let's say to anyone listening to this that you've had a child and then your brother or sister comes along and takes them away and you don't have right of reply. I mean, this is ridiculous. There's so much more to this than Julia ever makes out. Otherwise, Julia, the natural mother, could have just taken her son back. But she didn't. And so, as far as I can see, never contributed to his upbringing either, in terms of finance.
Why
in terms
didn't
of
Julia
actually-
care enough to want to raise John?
Well, I don't know. I never knew her. But she was clearly an unusual woman, Julia. I mean, she was very liberal. John Lennon, in 1979, did that audio diary in which he talks about a time when his mother had encouraged him to play truant from school, and they were lying on the bed, and something may have happened that was in its own way, in some small way, sexual. And we can't read any more into it because that's all we know. But that's unusual. Why would a mother allow that from her son?
Right.
One more thing, and again, I've got no axe to grind. I come to this book completely neutrally. But let's look at the facts. The most important thing in a teenager's life through the school years are the exams, because the exams will determine how you're going to proceed and progress in the rest of your life. In 1956-57, John Lennon at grammar school, Quarry Bank High School in Liverpool, had looming ahead of him the most important exams. Everything he'd been educated for since the age of 5 was going to culminate in these school-leaving exams. They're called O-levels.
Right.
O for ordinary levels. And they're pretty tough tests. And you do them in a range of subjects, up to 9 subjects. I did them myself. Well, Mimi was his auntie, and she's doing everything she can to make John make something of himself. He's a very bright boy. He's clearly capable of passing every exam if he wants to. His own mother is encouraging him to play truant. You have to ask yourself, what kind of a person does that? She was an unusual woman. Yeah. I'm not trying to cast aspersions on her character. I'm just saying that is a fact. And when you look at it as a fact, it's like a mother encouraging her son to play truant in the exam year. That's not usual. And therefore, we can deduce Julia was not usual.
On to another subject. The first songs that John and Paul wrote individually and together. We're going to start with John, because I know that he said that Hello Little Girl is the first song he ever wrote, but you mentioned in the book that there was a song called Calypso Rock that he wrote in 1957. How did you come upon this? And how do you know that it actually predates Hello Little Girl?
Well, he said it. John said it.
John said this?
John said it. All the quotes in the book are attributed to their source, and I think it was Trinidad Express in May 1971, off the top of my head. When he was out there, I think it was on there with a hunting Kyoko. It was one of those visits. They went there in the West Indies in May 71, and John would be, someone recognised him and said, "Can I interview you while you're here?" And probably because he was in the West Indies, he talked about Calypso Rock. He remembered that Calypso Rock was the first song he had ever written, and he said that. So when he said Hello Little Girl was the first song he wrote, he was really meaning the first song he remembered, the first song that stuck.
Right.
Because he had no means of recording them, hadn't yet worked out a way of actually committing to memory his song ideas. So Hello Little Girl is clearly in the Buddy Holly style.
Right.
So that Buddy Holly arrived in England in September 57, and John not only said Calypso Rock was before that, but he said he wrote it because there was a time when it was all the papers were full of the fact that Calypso was going to be taken over from rock and roll. Rock and roll was dead. This is 1957.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's been here 5 minutes and now it's dead. It's a fad. And the next fad is Calypso. It was actually being pushed by the American record companies as the next big thing. Mm-hmm. And so John wrote a song that had kind of foot in both camps, Calypso Rock. And he could never remember anything of it. He also wrote another song, which he remembered a line from only, about "My love is like a bird" or something like that. Again, That's from an interview with him. If you really look at the complete body of interviews that they've all done, you find all these little things just mentioned once. I mean, you get so many stories repeated ad infinitum, and then you'll get other nice little nuggets that have just been said once. And you to find in the Trinidad Express newspaper the fact of John's first song called Calypso Rock was a nice discovery.
Right. Now, likewise with Paul, he's always said "I Lost My Little Girl" was his first song. Very interesting. They both have "Little Girl" in the title, and they're both influenced by Buddy Holly.
And both written about the same time.
Yeah. And so in your book, you say that Suicide predates that song, and When I'm 64, the melody of it.
Yeah, without that title, because it had no words. But da 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 da
Right.
da, that he wrote that. Both of them, just probably before he was 14. Yeah. I Lost My Little Girl, again, very strong Buddy Holly influence, so that's got to be no earlier than September 57. That's when That'll Be the Day was released in Britain. But he's always talked about these earlier songs being written before rock and roll, he says. And they're clearly piano songs, so they're before he got a guitar. So it's undoubtedly undoubted that they came before.
It's also
Lost My
interesting,
Little Girl.
he wrote a lot of instrumentals in the late 50s,
Yeah.
like Hottest Sun and
Yeah.
songs like that.
Yeah. He wrote some great songs when he was like 16, 17 years old. I mean, Love Me Do, A World Without Love, Like Dreamers Do, Love of the Loved.
I was about to bring that up. I was surprised to learn, amongst the ones that you list here, What Goes On. This is around 1959.
Yeah.
What Goes On, A World Without Love, which I never knew was that far back. I'll Be On My Way, the instrumentals, Looking Glass, and Winston's Walk.
Yeah. Yeah. And we don't know much about some of those, but A World Without Love would go on to be a number one
Right.
in 1964.
And as Peter Asher has said, that when Paul offered him the song, he didn't have the middle eight written at that point.
Yeah.
But what proof do you have that some of these songs go back that far?
From interviews, from their own words.
Okay.
Yeah, their own words. What Goes On was one of John's earliest pieces, along with I Call Your Name.
Right.
Was another one. I don't think they were fully developed yet. I actually have heard a really early recording of What Goes On, probably from 62 or 3. I'm not exactly sure of the date, but and it's quite unlike the one that ended up on Rubber Soul.
Yeah, and they were considering recording it in '63 for the From Me to You sessions.
That's right, they were, yeah. In fact, the demo that I've heard probably is from around that period, but I don't know exactly.
Okay. You say that Paul had an exercise book from the Liverpool Institute where he had notes on his songs. Did you ever get to see this?
No, and I'm still uncertain as to whether that book still exists. We've heard so many things through the years about it got thrown out or it's still around, and I'm surprised if it does exist that he's never produced it in some way, because it would be a beautiful artifact to show on a TV appearance or in a film or whatever, or to have in one of his own books. So far as I know, since he hasn't ever produced it, it doesn't exist, but I hope it does. But I don't really know.
Okay. Now, the first two songs that John and Paul wrote together were Too Bad About Sorrows and Just Fun.
Yeah.
They've said that those are the first two, and
Yes.
Definitely Too Bad About Sorrows is the first one.
Yeah, that's what they say. I mean, I wasn't, as George Harrison would say and did say, I wasn't there. But yeah, that's what they've said consistently.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you do say that there was a gap there when they didn't write at all, and then they came back around 59 or so, or 1960 when they started to write again?
No, the gap, they did stop. The gap, it's hard to exactly put a date on it, but they don't appear, the songs in 59 appear to be pretty much all Paul's. As we said just a minute or two back, they actually began writing separately. So then they came together and wrote some songs, including Love Me Do and some of these really early ones. And then they appear to have not written again for quite a long time. And in fact, they were hardly writing separately either. In 59, Paul wrote this bunch of songs, but he didn't write much in 60 or 61, Paul. I'm not aware of anything really. 60, John wrote One After 909 in 60, but otherwise he wasn't really writing very much. And they only really came back together to write when they got the Parlophone contract in 62. That was the incentive for them to pick it up again.
Now, you did say about One After 909 that Cynthia might have helped with the lyrics.
Yeah.
And in many years from now, Paul said that he helped to write One After 909. So how do you determine if it's, John's song or just mainly John's song? Because so many Lennon-McCartney songs, you don't know how much of the two of them contributed.
This is not a precise science.
Yeah.
It's really hard. Paul never understood the lyric for One After 909, so I'm not exactly sure how much he contributed, but if he remembers something, then he must remember something.
Right.
Cynthia remembers sitting in the Jacaranda coffee bar in Liverpool with John when he was putting the lyrics down on a piece of paper, and I don't know how much she contributed, but she was there and she witnessed it, because that's a very clear memory for her, and I don't doubt it. So but it's mostly John's song.
Right.
And there is that snatch of recording from '69 when Paul is saying to John, I never really understood the lyric, it doesn't make any sense, which in a way suggests it was more John's than Paul's, because he's asking the question, otherwise
Right.
he'd know the answer. But it's not a precise science, and I wasn't there, and all you can go on is the available evidence.
Okay. You also bring up, and I don't recall where it's been said, but I guess it's been said several times. I never remembered hearing that on July 6th of 1957 that Paul not only played 20 Flat Rock and Bebop Balula, but he also did Long Tall Sally on the piano.
Yeah, he did definitely go to piano on that. In fact, one of the guys, Paul's then best friend, was a guy called Ian James, who had helped teach him to play guitar, and he was kind of Paul's best friend until he met John, and he remembers that quite clearly. So, yeah.
Now, as far as the meeting on July 6th, Paul has said, and this is in your book, that he believes that he met John before that when he was a paper boy. And I do recall Paul saying that there were times when he spotted him going on a bus. They didn't talk to each other, but he seems to remember visually seeing him.
Yeah.
So how much do you know about that?
I know pretty much all that's written in the book, which is that Paul McCartney, when he's in Liverpool, and he does still keep a house up there, so he's there from time to time. If he's picking someone up from the station or the airport, he may say, would you like me to give you a little bit of a tour? Now, I've never had this experience myself, unfortunately, but he does take sometimes some people on a tour of his Liverpool, which I assume is his Liverpool and the Beatles' Liverpool as well. And he will point out a place where he says he actually said a word or two to John before they actually properly met at the Walton Fete on July 6, 1957. It's outside a newsagent's shop, and I don't know exactly which one, but a guy in Liverpool assures me that the shop for which Paul used to do a paper round, or a paper route as I think you call it in America, was this particular shop. So I just say, well, maybe it was here. It's very much it's not exactly confirmed, this one, but I decided I would put it in because it was worthy of mentioning, but I can't give it any great weight because I don't really know. When I asked Paul to confirm it, which is something clearly he's never I mean, if he's mentioning this to people in the car, but never in any interview, you have to ask why. It must be because he doesn't want it out there in some way. He tells it privately only, but not publicly. And when I asked him if he would confirm it for this book, he didn't.
Interesting.
I mean, there's no doubt they really met on July the 6th, 1957. Whatever this encounter was, it was a brief nothing, really, but something, maybe.
Right. Ringo, we should give a lot of credit to him because you really make it clear that amongst what became the Fab Four, in the early years, he really was the most successful. And not only that, but he earned money. He's the only one that held a proper job for a long period of time.
Yeah.
Paul and George would have the odd job here and there, but he had a proper job, and he was responsible enough to feel that it's great to make a living as a musician. Until you can do that, you still got to hold down a job.
Yeah.
And still, between the Eddie Clayton Skiffle Group and Rory Storm, once things really picked up and he was making a good living, then he dumped the job.
Yeah.
And he also was the first one to have a car.
Yeah. I remember Paul very clearly in one of the interviews I did with him, not for this book but for something else, saying that to them, I think I quote it in the book, Ringo was a grown-up. You know, he'd been places. He had the suits and he had the background, you know, been working summer seasons in holiday camps and things that the Beatles had never got themselves organised enough to do. And yeah, they looked upon him as this dude who had actually got a car. You know, I mean, none of them had a car at that time. So they actually respected and admired him. And they always did for all sorts of reasons and still do.
You also say, and I didn't know this until I read it in your book, that Ringo was engaged
Yeah.
before Maureen.
Yeah, to Jerry McGovern, who said, you know, it's me or the drums. And it was the drums. Yeah.
Was it a serious relationship?
Well, they were engaged. They were planning to get married. And Ringo was considering converting to Catholicism to marry her.
That's pretty serious.
Yeah, I would say that's pretty serious. But the drums saved him. And he threw in the job as well, which was big stuff then. In a 5-year apprenticeship, to give it up after 4 years was, I mean, his parents, his mum and his stepdad and all the family and everybody, they all had an opinion, and I'm sure they were all anti it, and they were all telling him it, and no doubt there were big shouting debates and arguments and all that, and the girlfriend was saying don't do it, but he had this desire. He wanted to play drums. He wanted to be unconfined, if you like, and go where the work was, go where the music was, and just play drums for as long as he possibly could. And here he is 50 odd years later still playing them.
Right.
His story is a fantastic story, and it's somewhat surprising that it has to be a book all these years on, 2013, before we actually get to read, having had all these books about the Beatles, just what an incredible story the Ringo Starr story really is. And that's because the other writers don't want to give him that leeway. They don't want to look at it. They bring him into the story. Typically, Ringo will enter the Beatle books in 1962. You'll get a bit of his backstory, and to bring him up to speed with the others, and then you carry on as John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And I felt I should bring him in from the start, because he's there in Liverpool at the same time as the others, going to the same movies and buying the same records and playing the same halls, and they're crossing paths all the time. So it makes much more sense to have them all in it together from the beginning.
People like to say he was so lucky to have joined the Beatles, but they don't realize that he was making a living as a musician before they were able to.
Yeah, they were lucky to get him, is the actual truth of it. It was a beautiful partnership. It was he wanted to always be with the best bands, and the best bands had always gone for him, which is an important point I find in the book. He was with the best skiffle group in Liverpool, and before the Beatles, the best rock group were Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and they had him. And then the Beatles wanted him. So he was always in demand from the top band around, because he was the best drummer. Or if not the very best drummer, he was the drummer that they could all work with so brilliantly. He gave the Beatles exactly what they were looking for and never had with Pete.
Yeah, you actually say that in one of the last shows of 1961, when he filled in, it was like they knew this was the perfect fit.
Yeah. If you're in a band, the chemistry is absolutely crucial to any group of people in any walk of life, but particularly if you're up there on a stage trying to create something. If one of them isn't quite gelling properly, you know it if you're in that band, and similarly you know it when it's right. And as soon as Ringo got on drums, it felt right for them, and that isn't me saying it, it's them saying it.
Right.
George in particular was a great advocate of Ringo, and then I may have said this to you before, but the name order within the Beatles of John, Paul, George and Ringo is absolutely vital. It doesn't just trip nicely off the tongue. It is true that John started it. He comes first. He's the leader. He brought in Paul. Paul brought in George, and George brought in Ringo. I mean, they all agreed to have Ringo, but it was George who was pushing it.
Right.
And consequently, Ringo's relationship with George was different to his relationship with John and Paul, because it was George who got him in there in the first place, and they always had that particular closeness.
Let's talk about Stu Sutcliffe. A couple things. First, on a musical level. While it's often said that he couldn't play the bass, you say that after 1 year of playing the bass, he was actually a good bass player.
I don't say, Klaus Voormann says it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because it's been written in all the books that he can never play at all, and certain people want to defend him now, and I just wanted to know, what the truth was about his ability at all.
I think he was only a beginner at the beginning.
He certainly was.
I mean, at the beginning, he obviously didn't know his way around the strings, and they had to teach him what little they knew about it. And he was fumbling around, and we have that photograph of the audition for Billy Fury, where he's standing with his back to Larry Parnes and Billy Fury and Mark Forster, who are there to judge the talent in front of them. And Paul has said to Stuart, stand with your back to them. That was Paul's idea. So that they wouldn't see that he was fumbling his way around. But that was May 1960. He was with them until the end of June 61. And they played a lot. I mean, they played all those hours in Hamburg. So he wasn't always a beginner. And if Klaus... I don't believe Klaus has an agenda when he says that Stuart was actually a good bass guitarist towards the end. I can well believe it.
Right.
I mean, Klaus wouldn't say it if it wasn't true, I don't think. So, yeah.
Okay.
And similarly, Bob Wooler always said he never, there's this myth about he stood with his back to the audience. I never saw him stand with his back to the audience. That myth comes from the photograph, But the photograph is just a snapshot of a moment in time. The next day, he could have turned around. And evidently, some point in the coming months after that, he did. Yeah.
Okay. About his singing. We know little about his singing. We know that he sang Love Me Tender. And in the last year or two, there was this tape that leaked out, and people were questioning whether or not it was Stu Sutcliffe, and nobody could verify it. Do you have any information as to how well he could sing? Because at one point in the book, you do say that the Beatles weren't really playing that well as musicians, but the one good thing about them was their harmonies.
Yeah.
So if Stu was a part of the harmonies...
Yeah. Well, he'd been a choir boy. I imagine that was before his voice broke, but all the same, he was evidently capable of holding a song, and probably had learned to a degree how to read music as well. So I think he was probably a pretty good singer. Astrid and others who regularly witnessed him singing Love Me Tender say it was always beautiful. Now, I don't know, because I wasn't there, but I don't think it would have been terrible by any means. I think he could probably hold a tune fine, because he had been a choir boy.
The very complicated relationship of John, Paul, and Stu.
Yeah.
The way that I look at it, Paul was jealous of the friendship of John and Stu. I mean, looking at it, especially reading your book page by page, here's Paul. He meets John July 6, 1957. He becomes best friends with him. All the other choir men get phased out. He's John's guy. Then all of a sudden, Stu moves in, and he becomes John's best friend. And not only that, to the point where when they're finally going to Hamburg, and they're playing the Indra, and they got to sleep in the Babykino, John, Stu, and George sleep in one room, and Paul gets Pete, who's kind of low man on the totem pole. And I'm thinking, what's going on here? It's almost like he's being demoted.
But these are not necessarily, these are not legends. These are 5 young lads who've got 2 rooms with just about, if they're lucky, 5 beds to sleep on, and they pile in. You know, just like guys at camp or anything like that. They just pile into the room, and the first 3 who get into that room get those 3 beds. And as I say, Paul might have only been 1 second behind, but he's missed it. There's 3 beds and they're taken, and he's got to be in the other room where there are 2 beds, and he's there, and Pete's last.
So that's the only reason why it happened that way?
Well, so far as I know, I can't imagine it was anything. I wasn't there, but I can't imagine it was anything more than that. It's just guys bundling in. John would be first because he was always first. He was the leader. And then the others, it might just have been that Paul stopped to tie his shoelace outside. I don't know. But whatever it is, he's gone into this corridor fourth, which doesn't mean anything. But suddenly when they arrive in the room, it means something because there's only 3 beds. I think that's probably all there was to it. But there is that letter from Stuart back to Rod Murray from that trip when he says that Paul is the black sheep of the trip and everyone hates him. And I think he was probably getting on everyone's nerves. Because, well, that's what the letter's saying, isn't it? You know?
Is it because, well, you can only say so much not being there, but because of that relationship?
It's because of probably lots of things. Jealousy of Stuart in all sorts of ways for his friendship with John and for his friendship with Astrid and Jürgen and Klaus. And that's also quite clear that because Paul's relationship with Stuart was always very strained, and I mean, John always said Paul hated him, you know, Paul hated Stuart, which must mean it was manifest. Then those who were close to Stuart would take a dimmer view of Paul, naturally. And these are Paul's own words. He says, you know, Astrid and Mrs. Sutcliffe and all that, they never really liked me very much. And why? Because he was always mean to Stuart. You know, if I've got a problem with a guy, his friends are not going to like me very much, right? Because I'm projecting angst towards their friend. The thing with I think John had been friends with Stuart before Stuart was invited to join the group. They'd been friends for a while, a couple of years maybe, at art school. But there's a story that Paul himself will tell, and I can't stress this often enough. None of this is me saying this. It's about finding them saying it and using the material that's come out of their own mouths. And one of the stories that Paul tells in the anthology is about them riding on a bus. Now, these guys rode buses everywhere. Liverpool's always full of buses, big double-decker green buses. And they never had cars, so they're always riding buses wherever they go. And if you can imagine, the best place on the bus, certainly in England, is go upstairs, sit at the front. That's the hot seat on the bus, and if it's available, you'll always go to it. Well, it had always been John and Paul in the front seats on the bus, with in the row behind them, leaning forward, eager to join in, George, the younger one, third guy. He's behind them. And when Stuart joins the group, literally, Stuart sits next to John on the bus, and Paul is demoted to the second seat with the younger guy, George, and he's been squeezed out. Now, this is just human stuff. This is not legends. This is not the Beatles. This is just guys.
Right.
Just guys on a bus, mates, friends. And this happens all the time in life, and we've all experienced something like that. And naturally, his nose was put out of joint. Whose wouldn't be? Mine would have been. He wanted to be with John, and now he can't be. He's in the second row. That's a true story, and he tells it. And in that story, you can hear what his problem was. He was jealous. I mean, who wouldn't be jealous? Because they all wanted to be with John. John was their fairground hero, another of Paul's phrases. He was their fairground hero. He was the big guy riding the Dodgems, as Paul has explained it.
Even Paul had to compete with George for John's friendship.
Yeah, but always had a different... They all had their best relationship with John, which is another interesting angle in this story, by the way. Out of George, Ringo and John, who was Paul closest to? John. Out of Ringo, Paul and John, who was George closest to? John. Or maybe Ringo. And similarly, out of Ringo's best relationships, who could it have been? Well, he had a good one with George, but he had a great one with John as well. John was the leader. It was his group, and they always looked up to him as the leader all the way through. And this is not about me saying he was the best Beatle or he was the most important Beatle. It's simply within the chemistry of that group, because within any group of people you have a chemistry, that John was the leader. He was the older guy. He'd started it. It was his group.
Let's talk about Stu Sutcliffe. I have to bring this up because it's such an important point that you bring up in your book, and you mentioned this in our previous interview, that towards the end of 1961, the Beatles were on the verge of breaking up. Now, when I read your book, a lot of that information's coming from Bob Wooler. Did you get anybody else to verify that that was the status of the Beatles at that moment?
No, there's just Bob Wooler, and who's very emphatic about it and was very close to them, and John Lennon as well. A couple of little quotes that you can find and apply them to this period. So that's about it. But I don't doubt it, because it was part of their psychological constitution that when they got bored, if there was no fresh challenge for them, no obvious thing to do next, that they would become restless. And that trip to Paris came at a pretty crucial time for John and Paul. Well, for all of them, but just John and Paul went. Again, there's this assumption that, they were the Beatles from the moment they got together until the moment they broke up. But things change through the years, and there are moments come and go when you can be keen or less keen, or suddenly fancy doing something different for a while. And they almost broke up in 60, and maybe did for a few days, and then they seem to have come close to it in 61, and might have done if Brian hadn't come along, probably would have done. And then on a legal technicality, they actually did break up in 62 for the blink of an eye. But that's a whole other story. But, it's not just one continuous path. I mean, life isn't like that. Life is much more real than that. And I don't doubt that Bob Wooler was right when he said that they were really, really getting fed up. They'd reached a dead end and they didn't know what to do next, and they may have broken up.
I find it really fascinating and so believable. And to give the Beatles credit, they had gone as far as they could possibly go without having a manager. I mean, they were constantly working, and they were also getting paid better than all the other Liverpool bands anyway, and they did all that on their own.
Yeah, well, the best did it for them a lot. The money that they were earning far more, as you say, than anyone else, and somehow weren't very pleased about it. They put their price up really high to test the promoters to see how far they would be prepared to go. And when the promoters paid them, they strangely enough didn't respect them for it. It was just like, well, it was too easy. It was too easy. They really did need Brian Epstein, and he came along at the very moment they needed him most.
And they were also, you bring up the Paris trip, they canceled 2 weeks of gigs for
Yeah.
that. I mean, imagine...
They were going for a month originally, until Bob Wooler said make it 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And really talked them into it.
But they must have made all the venues and the promoters furious at them. They burned a lot of bridges then.
They did. When Brian came along, not only, I mean, he made a promise to them that he would try and like double their earnings or something like that. You know, earn them much, much more per week than they were earning. And yet at the time he said that, almost all their opportunities for earning money in Liverpool had been burned by the Beatles' behaviour. And he had to create these opportunities that would earn them more money. He didn't just go back to the promoters who were booking them and say, pay them more, please. He actually had to create the opportunities that paid them the money. His job was really hard. They had a terrible reputation when he took them on. I mean, they were always turning up late, and their attitude was not a good one, always.
Talk a little bit about Brian, because tell me all or some of the contributions that he made to the group. One of the things that I found really interesting, which I didn't know before, was that he insisted that George get to sing more lead vocals on stage.
Yeah. I don't absolutely know that he insisted, but it coincides with the beginning of Brian's management. That the set lists show John, Paul and George taking a lead vocal in turn all the way through each of the sets that they did. And I think it started when Brian became their manager. As I say in the book, I can't be certain that he caused that, but he was always an advocate for the fact that they had 3 lead vocalists and they could alternate on stage between one singing and 2 backing, and then the other one sings and then these 2 back, and so on. And that gave them great appeal on stage. But as I also say in the book, even if it was Brian's idea, John and Paul must have gone along with it, because though Brian's business card stated that he had sole direction over the Beatles, no one ever had sole direction over these guys. If they didn't want to do something, they wouldn't do it, and they would tell you why they wouldn't do it in 2 short words.
Well, I think it's so remarkable, and I think I told you this when I first interviewed you, when the Beatles Live came out. From the moment that he became their manager, they got a record deal within 6 months, which is extraordinary.
6 months to the day since Brian first sees them in the Cavern, November 1961. He's walking out of Abbey Road with a contract. It came about through unusual circumstances, but he got it all the same. And within a year of him managing them, they were in the charts.
That's amazing. Yeah. Plus, he also managed to get them on the BBC, on BBC Radio.
Yeah.
He did all the right things for someone who didn't have any management experience.
No music, no management of a rock group, that's for sure. But he had management, and in particular he had administrative experience. He was a brilliant administrator. And one of the joys of research for me on this book was gaining access to files for Brian's first 18 months of management of the Beatles. Not all of them, but a good collection of papers, which included the papers relating to the dismissal of Pete. So that's how I'm able to tell that story more fully. From a documentary point of view as well as an anecdotal one.
Mm-hmm. Let's just talk briefly about the Deco edition, because I remember talking to Pete Best about it, and he was saying to me that the 15 songs chosen were chosen by Brian because he wanted to show the group's versatility.
Well, they certainly, if that was his impact on their set list that day, is one of 2, that was a good one, because that was what they had above all other bands in Liverpool at that time, was their versatility. They could do all these different styles and types of music. I'm not so sure that he really did have much of a hand in their set list. The set list they played at Decca was the same one they were doing on stage, and there is a quote from John Lennon saying that we did pretty much what we did at the Cavern. So, but the one difference that is clearly made to that set list, and this is again, you said that when Brian became their manager, George began to sing equally, have equal stage time at the microphone with John and Paul. The other thing that happened is pretty much the week that Brian becomes their manager, the Beatles start performing their own songs on stage for the first time. John and Paul had never really considered them good enough for their audiences. They were always slightly embarrassed about them, felt they wouldn't go down very well, and didn't play them. They begin playing them the same week Brian becomes their manager. Again, unlikely to be coincidence, but I don't absolutely know that he said they should do it, but it's highly likely that he did. And his involvement, as far as I can tell, in their set list at Decca was to make sure they did some of their own songs, and they did 3. And ultimately, it was those 3 that, by a combination of weird events, got them the Parlophone contract, because that was what Ardmore and Beechwood were interested in, those songs. So if Brian meddled in their set list, it worked. That's another myth, that Brian interfered with their set list and they hated him for it and they told him never to meddle in their music again and all that. It doesn't. You won't find any actual source material saying that. It comes from something that comes from something, and it's been embroidered and added to, but it's not really the case. Everyone repeats it, but no one actually looks at how it started, that story.
But this whole idea of George singing more, you notice that in the Beatles live and in the songs that you list of what they did live, and also especially in the BBC recordings.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, he was a big part of their act, and when John and Paul's songs begin to become successful, and when their stage time reduces because they're doing those tours where they can only play 25 minutes, then naturally they're going to be focusing on the songs that people want to hear, or that they're hits, essentially. And that means that George's microphone time suddenly reduces. But through 62 and into the beginning of 63, he's got equal microphone time.
Right. Also, when they were doing original songs, since George wasn't writing as much,
that's it.
He got less time on the records.
Yeah, that's it.
You do say in the book, and this is the first time I've ever seen this anywhere, that Ask Me Why was actually influenced by a Miracle song.
Yeah.
And I've played the Miracle song, and I don't necessarily hear it.
Right.
But where did you get that from?
That comes from John saying it was based on a Miracle song, which is from an interview somewhere. And knowing when he wrote it, which was they first did it on stage just in April 62, and the Miracles' latest record out at that time was What's So Good About Goodbyes, and Brian had enthused about this record in his column in Merseybeat newspaper, which I'm sure would have been John telling him, "Oh, this is a great song," and Brian wrote what a great song it was. And there are similarities to it instrumentally, and the Miracle song says "Tell Me Why," includes the words "Tell Me Why" in the lyric, and John's is "Ask Me Why," and it's got the word "misery" in it as well, I think. And there are just similarities in structure. It's not the same song by any means, but it's a jumping off point, I think.
Okay, you talk about myths. This will be my last question. Name just a couple that have been mentioned a lot through the years that you've proven to be untrue.
Well, we've done it in this interview. I mean, the Brian didn't change their Decca set list, is one. Another would be that they didn't want to wear the suits, and Brian forced them into suits, and they became, these pretty boys in suits. They actually designed these suits. They were involved in their design and had a definite say in their look, and they went for that look in particular. And that was what they wanted. So, and they were very particular about it, says the tailor. And again, it's not me saying it, it's the tailor who says they chose the fabric, they chose the pattern, they wanted the legs just like this, they wanted the lapels. So, they weren't forced into these suits. So there's one.
Okay. We should start a radio show, the Lost Lewisohn tapes. There's way too much to cover here. I mean, see my notes. I got like 53 questions.
Yeah. I'm sorry we only got through some of them, but it's been nice to do it all the same.
Yeah. Mark, thank you so much. This was total joy.
Thank you, Ken. For me too.